The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us this morning for our webinar, Gas Gathering Rule, Am I Affected? My name is Marissa Davis, and I'll be facilitating the presentation today. The host of today's webinar, G2 Integrated Solutions, an EN engineering company, provides responsive support and a comprehensive suite of asset integrity, engineering, GIS services, field services, regulatory compliance, and software and technology solutions that address asset performance through its lifecycle. For more information on our services, please visit our website. Okay, so let me introduce you to our panel today. First up, we have Al Giordano, who leads our regulatory compliance team here at G2. We have Wally McGahee, our director of regulatory compliance, both of which are former PHMSA inspectors. Terry Strahan, who manages our GIS team, and Tracy Thorlifson, our VP of software. Tracy leads our software development team. So Al and Wally are going to start us off this morning discussing the gas gathering rule, and when they're finished, then Terry and Tracy will join in them for some Q&A and some panel discussion. So at any point during the presentation, if you have any questions, if you'll go ahead and just submit them through the question box here on GoToWebinar, we will be happy to answer them. So with that, I will turn it over to you guys.
Thanks, Marissa. Good morning, everybody. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us here this morning to talk about the new gas gathering rule. We're going to discuss what's been promulgated, what constitutes gathering lines, what changes are being made, and what operators should expect to do moving forward. So as a refresher, back in November of 2021, PHMSA promulgated the final rule for the update of the gas gathering line regulations. This is a bit of a shift in PHMSA's oversight, as gathering lines are a really big sector of the pipeline industry that have not been overly regulated to date. PHMSA is anticipating that a large amount of known mileage will be added to the overall regulated tally of pipelines. However, this estimation is based on the fact that operators knowing that they have gathering lines that will be considered to be regulated. One point of concern here is that there are operators that have never been regulated that are that do have gathering lines that would fall under the regulated status now. So these incidental operators don't make up any of the initial estimates, but we do anticipate that there are going to be some new operators coming aboard. A couple big things on this update. This update does include reporting requirements for all gas gathering lines, including those previously mentioned that were unregulated, and then provides additional definitions for gathering lines based on diameter, location, and SMICE to become subject to specific parts of the pipeline safety, existing pipeline safety regulations. So this is just a quick graphic to provide a simplified version of what's considered to be a gathering line. Gathering lines are considered to be those coming from oil or gas wells that are collecting and transporting commodities to processing plants. So you'll see there on the left-hand side of the screen, gathering lines coming from gas wells and from oil and gas shale play type wells. So this is the focus of PHMSA's rulemaking. So as currently defined in 49 CFR 192, gathering lines are considered to be pipelines that transport gas from production facilities to transmission lines. This is a graphic that's out of PHMSA's gathering line FAQs. The FAQs do reference the definitions provided in API RP80. Those are incorporated by reference. PHMSA has provided a lot of these graphical interpretations to help operators determine if they do or do not have regulated gathering lines or what may be considered part of a gathering system. So if an operator is looking for a place to start to determine if they do have gathering lines, the FAQs are a great place for some good information. So currently, there are two gas gathering classifications listed in the regulations, both of which are limited to class 2 or greater locations. Type A being the metallic with a MAOP of a hoop stress of 20% or more of SMICE, and then non-metallic with the MAOP of greater than 125 pounds. And then the type B is the same, they just have different classifications for the location of the area. So for a large portion of these gathering lines that are located in remote areas, they don't really ever come into play because they're not located in a class 2 or 3 or 4 location. And so what PHMSA has done is they've expanded the requirements for these gathering lines to bring some of these more regulated lines into play. So what's changed? The most marked change is that previously unregulated larger diameter gathering lines that are operating at greater than 20% SMICE are now going to become regulated. Additionally, we're going to talk about some reporting for all gathering lines, which are going to include the type R lines, and we'll define these as well. So the effective date, May 16th of this year, 2022, there exists programs, these lines to include reporting and then any other applicable. Again, I just want to reflect the fact that this is a fairly marked change, as there are going to be a large amount of unintentional operators that don't realize that they're going to be part of this regulation. So if you're aware of any operators that have historically never been subject to regulations, reach out to them, let them know that, hey, these are coming around and they should take a look and see if they're going to be affected. So the first part of the gathering line rule talks about reporting. So the update in 49 CFR 191 provides the requirements for reporting for gathering lines. This includes annual reporting under 191.17, which is applicable to all gathering lines, type A, B, type C, the new type C, and the type R lines. 191.23 for safety-related conditions is for type A, B, and C gathering lines, the not type R lines. And then just as a point of reflection here, 191.29 for the National Pipeline Mapping System, operators of gathering lines are not required to add their maps for the gathering lines up to the NPMS system. They're still required to retain maps for their lines, but they're not required to put them into NPMS. So we talked about type C and type R. What do they mean? So again, the new rule creates both the type C gathering line and the type R gathering line. Type C lines are considered to be those gathering lines with an outside diameter greater than or equal to 8.625 inches and any of the following. So it could be any of the following three classifications. They're either metallic and they have an MAOP with a up to 20% more of the SMICE. If they have an unknown stress level and they have an MAOP greater than 125 pounds, or they can be non-metallic, plastic, composite, and the MAOP is greater than 125 pounds. So this expands the larger diameter, higher pressure gathering lines. This brings those into play here under regulation. And then the type R lines. Type R lines are pretty much any onshore gathering line that doesn't meet the existing A, B, or C definitions. So those operators of type R lines are required to report those lines as part of an annual report, but otherwise don't have any other additional requirements that they're going to have to meet. And so additionally, the preamble of the final rule defines incidental gathering on new, replaced, relocated, or otherwise changed gathering lines. So the applicability for incidental gathering was done to avoid some disruption that's associated with reclassifying some previously unregulated existing gathering lines as transmission lines, and hopefully reduce the final overall cost of the final rule for the existing infrastructure. This incidental gathering exception will be limited to 10 miles or less. And so for folks that are unaware, the incidental gathering lines, basically it's a definition out of API RP80, basically the end point of the gathering based on some of the definitions may be used if the pipeline terminates 10 or more miles downstream from the furthest most downstream endpoint as defined in API RP80. If it's 10 miles or less in length, it's considered to be incidental gathering and is not subject to the regulations. So the bulk of the workload here in the gas gathering line falls under operators that have to determine what lines are regulated and to what level they're going to be regulated. So the code defines type C lines, and it also provides for multiple levels of regulations depending on the type of line that you have. So there's a couple different layers to this. So the first layer, the first criteria are type C lines that have an outside diameter of greater than 8.625 inches. These requirements apply to all lines that meet this definition. So you have to have a damage prevention plan, and you have to have an emergency plan, And then for any type C lines that meet this requirement, you have to have design, installation, construction, inspection, and testing requirements for the new line or the replaced line that goes into the ground or sits on the ground. This is the base level requirement for the type C lines. And then so on top of this, PHMSA has added a couple of different layers of additional regulations. So the second criteria applies to a type C line with an OD between 8.625 and 12.75 inches. All of the requirements for of criteria 1 for the type C lines apply, and then additionally they're required to have a public awareness plan. They're required to install line markers. They must have a corrosion control plan, and they must conduct leakage surveys. So all of these items are to be conducted with the existing regulation, in accordance with the existing regulations in 49 CFR Part 192 is applicable. There is something here for the level 2 and level 3 criteria called a PIR exemption. So the potential impact radius exemption is a gathering line where the segment is not within, does not have a BIHO or otherwise inside the PIR. And the PIR is calculated using a different factor. So normally, the PIR is calculated with a factor of 0.69. This new rule requires you, if you want to use the PIR exemption, to use a factor of 0.73. So it gives a more conservative estimate of the potential impact radius. So again, these exceptions are there for those lines that may be, in very remote areas where there's not a problem with having, anybody inside of that potential impact radius. So just again, to reflect this fact, any gathering line that's less than 16 inches or less than 16 inches in diameter and meets one of the following requirements, again, being not located within a PIR that has a BIHO or other impacted site and uses a factor of 0.73 to calculate the PIR, you don't need to have the following as part of your program. So corrosion control, public awareness, you don't have to put line markers in, and you don't have to conduct leakage surveys. And then you don't have to meet all of the plastic pipe requirements. So one of the key parts here to note is the use of the term A, right? So not located within a PIR containing a BIHO, or not located within a classification containing a BIHO or other impacted site. So this denotes that one singular BIHO or other impacted site will cause this exception not to be applicable. That's just something to take into consideration there. And then finally, the third layer, the third criteria of type C lines are any line that has an OD greater than 12.75 or less than 16 inches, or anything greater than 16 inches. So if you're greater than 16 inches, you have to do all of these things, and there is no PIR exemption. If you are between 12.75 and 16 inches, you have to do these things unless you can qualify for the PIR exemption. Again, you must meet all the requirements of the type 1 and type 2 lines. You also must establish an MAOP in accordance with 192.619 and maintain records. So you're required to have your strength testing and your MAOP records in accordance with the existing regulations. And then if the line is or contains plastic, you have to meet all the requirements for plastic pipe, except for if you're using a composite material, and we'll talk about composite materials here in a short second. So compliance dates, what does this mean? When do we have to come into compliance with this rule? So by November 16th of 2022, so effective 6 months from the effective date of the rule, we talked about the effective date being May 16th. So operators must have identified all of their type C lines and started to bring them into their pipeline safety programs if they are applicable. Compliance with the entirety of 192.9, which is the new gathering rule, is due 1 year from the effective date, so May 16th, 2023. PHMSA has also provided an alternate date if you request that alternate date approval. You have to submit for that alternative deadline 90 days prior to May 16th, 2023 if you request that. So if you are looking at your lines and you determine that you can't come into compliance by May 16th, or that you request more time, you can submit for an extension from PHMSA. You must submit some additional information in order to do that. You have to provide a description of what the facilities are, what the environment, operating environment is, and what may affect the reasoning for your inability to meet the deadline, you must propose an alternative deadline. So you have to tell PHMSA when you're going to be able to meet it for each of the effective requirements. So maybe you'll be able to meet one requirement by date A and another requirement by date B. So you have to clearly outline that in your plan. You have to provide a justification for why you're asking for this. So provide your justification and reasoning. And you have to provide also the actions that you plan to take to ensure the safety of the affected facilities in the interim. So again, identification of type C lines, November 16th, 2022, full compliance by May 16th of 2023. Now, if you're an operator that has a line, say in a class 1 area, and you note that there is going to be a change in the class location or population density due to whatever reason, you have 1 year from the date of determination of applicability to include that specific segment of line in the required pipeline safety programs. So again, 1 year from the date of determination of a class change or population density increase. So the other big thing that PHMSA put in the gathering rule was composite materials. PHMSA is allowing the use of composite materials that are not otherwise authorized for use in 49 CFR 192. You have to tell PHMSA 90 days prior to the start of construction if you plan to use these composite materials, and you have to provide all of this information as listed to PHMSA as part of the request for authorization. And a couple key things to note here, the general information is there, start endpoints, coordinates. You have to perform an HCA analysis, so you have to provide them with the description of the pipeline and the identification of any HCAs that may be along that segment of line. And then the last three here are probably the more relevant topics to mention. You have to provide detailed procedures and test requirements that you're going to use on this system, right? How do you plan on testing the line to make sure it's safe? How do you plan on maintaining the line to make sure it's safe and stay safe for the entirety of the life of the pipeline? You have to provide an explanation of why this material is going to be in the best interest of the public. Is there a specific reason that you as the operator chose to use a composite material over a previously approved steel or plastic material? And then you also have to have a certification signed by someone at the VP level or higher in the operating company that the operations of this pipeline would be consistent with the existing pipeline safety requirements. So that's going to take a little bit of justification to show that you're going to be able to meet the requirements for these lines. So if you're planning on going in with composite materials for any of these gathering lines, please make sure you're taking these into account well in advance of when you plan to put it in the ground. All right, so finally, what do we need to do now? Operators that knowingly have gathering lines in their system should start to evaluate them to determine if you have any lines that would now qualify as a type C line. Operators should be starting to calculate mileage for inclusion in their 2022 annual report. So the reporting requirements under the new rule, the 2022 annual report that is submitted in March of 2023 is required to contain the mileage for all gathering lines in your system. The 2021 annual report that's coming due next month is not, but operators should start to take action to calculate the mileage and make sure that they have an accurate count. For operators that have identified a type C line that is going to be required to meet the aforementioned sections of code, you should begin to develop an integration plan for bringing this mileage into your existing pipeline safety programs. Or if you don't have a pipeline safety program for these new type C lines, you should begin to start to develop some of these programs that are applicable to these segments of line. So really the biggest things right now for operators to do is really determine what they have and what is going to be, what if anything will be regulated. So that's the general presentation. Just wanted to kind of review the rule, review some actions to take right now. I'm going to open it up to our panel and see if anybody has any questions.
So we do have a couple questions here. Let me see. Says, am I required to map my gathering system and run class location analysis to satisfy the requirements of the final rule?
I'll go ahead and take a shot at that one, Marissa.
Okay.
The bottom line is that you are of course required to retain maps of your systems, right? But you're not, according to the final rule, required to submit mapping data to the National Pipeline Mapping System. So your maps may not be fully up to snuff, but the thing to understand here is that you can make a rough determination of your type C lines just based purely on diameter and percentage of SMICE, right? And bearing in mind that class 1 basically is anything that's not class 2 or 3 or 4. And if you don't have any structures, buildings intended for human occupancy anywhere near your lines, then you're going to be in class 1. Right, so you can get started on it without necessarily having detailed maps of your lines. But bearing in mind that that from this point forward, you do have to be paying attention to changes in class and really managing your system from that standpoint. You really should be looking at getting your gathering systems adequately mapped from a GIS standpoint as quickly as possible. And just as an aside, our gas HCA tool has already been updated to calculate class C and class R. So, you know, the software tools that we have are already updated for that.
Sorry, I was on mute. It says, if I now have a compressor in line with newly regulated gathering lines, will I have to comply with the regulations governing compressors?
That's an excellent question. And there are other questions similar to it regarding some of the regulatory language that's in this gathering line rule. I can only tell you at this point that the answer to that question and similar questions will be forthcoming from PHMSA. At this point in time, we don't have a definitive answer from them. Explicitly in the regulatory language, it's not included. That doesn't necessarily mean that it won't be considered to be something that needs to be done.
Okay, it says, Al, you referred to a category of pipeline operators as incidental operators. Is an incidental operator defined in the regulation? And if so, what is the definition? And does this category alter what is required by the regulation?
So incidental operators are not defined in regulation. Incidental operators is a term that we use to describe those folks that are running gathering lines that currently don't know that they're affected by the regulations. There are operators out there that have gathering lines that have historically never been regulated. They've been outside, you know, the type A and type B classifications of gathering lines. But with this new rule, again, what it does with the type R is it requires all onshore gathering lines to be reported. And so when I use the term incidental operators, I'm referring to those operators that historically have never had to submit an annual report, never had to interact with any sort of regulatory body, that now have a requirement to at least report their mileage back to PHMSA as part of their annual report. And so I wanted to mention that to just make a point of, if you know people that are operating in this fashion, make sure that they're aware of these regulations that are out there now, because one, it's important for them to know, okay, now I'm going to be affected by a specific regulation, and two, I need to make a determination of what, if any, actions I need to take as an operator in order to come into compliance. And it also allows PHMSA to get a more accurate count of the affected mileage of gathering lines and the total mileage of gathering lines that we actually have.
So it says, what are the requirements for MAOP substantiation, meaning what method can be used?
Oh, sorry. So right now, the preamble references 192.619A2, so conducting just a normal pressure test using design characteristics as required for a normal pipeline.
Says, if we build an 8-inch pipeline and establish a 1440 PSI MAOP, but only operate at less than 100 PSI, does it still fall under a type C?
I would suggest that if you do the pressure test on your pipeline and you establish an MAOP of 1440 PSI, then you have established an operating pressure that that pipeline is capable of. So therefore, it would bring you into that greater than 20% SMICE classification. And regardless of what you actually operated at on any given day, the potential is there for you to operate it at that pressure. So I would suggest, yes, that it would fall into this type C status.
Okay. It says the rule requires a methodology to determine gathering versus production, etc. What is the expectation for the methodology using API RP80? Anyone? Also, in the meantime, we've had a few people ask if you're going to get a copy of the slide deck, and the answer to that is yes. After the presentation today, I'll send you a link to the recording as well as the actual presentation itself in a PDF format. So, and if you guys want, go ahead.
Yeah, Marissa, let me go back and answer Jameson's question.
Sure.
The rule requires a methodology to determine gathering versus production. What's the expectation for the methodology using RP80? Again, the criteria is laid out in RP80, but the designation of gathering has been clearly defined now for type A, B, C, and R in the regulation. So however your system or however your pipelines would fall into the classification using RP80 would determine whether or not it was a regulated gathering line. I don't know, I don't fully understand your question, I guess. You're either going to follow the requirements of 192.9 that give definition to the gathering lines, or you're going to use RP80 to establish the classification of the pipeline itself.
And that methodology is laid out in RP80.
Correct, Terry. That's right, Tracy. Yep.
Okay. Can a current transmission line be reclassified as incidental gathering if it meets the requirements of incidental gathering?
Rich, I'm not certain what would cause that to occur. If it's currently a transmission line, what would be the, if the criteria of the pipeline system meets an incidental gathering definition as now stated in the rule, then I would expect that an operator could possibly reclassify it as incidental gathering. But once it's established as a transmission line, I think it would be very difficult to back it up. The justifications would be large in my mind. I don't know for certain. There's a lot of unknowns in your question, so it would be difficult to clearly answer that.
All right. Does anyone else have any other questions? Give you a couple seconds to put them in there if you do. No? Going once? Going twice? All right. Looks like you guys got about a half an hour back on your schedule this morning. That's all the questions we have for today. We hope you enjoyed the presentation. Like I said earlier, I'll be sending out a copy of the presentation as well as a link to the recording. So be on the lookout for that. Hope you have a great rest of your day and a wonderful weekend, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
I'd just like to say, Melissa, that if
sure.
there are additional questions and people want to reach out, please do so. We'd be more than glad to have a conversation with you.
Yep. Have a good day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.